Hugo Spowers is the driving force behind a small company in Ludlow, England, with the poetic name of Riversimple, which is tackling one of the most important and intractable of all environmental questions. I'm talking about our passionate addiction to the private automobile. Hugo Spowers was a designer, builder, and restorer of classic racing cars before his concern about the environmental impact of autos led him to sell his company to his employees and put his energies into the development of a green automobile. Riversimple's sweeping goal is to systematically pursue the elimination of environmental damage caused by personal transport. To do this, Spowers and his colleagues have reimagined not just the automobile, but the whole industry. Riversimple is building a different car out of different materials with a different fuel, hydrogen, and a completely different business model. It won't sell you the car, it will only lease it to you. It gives away its technology over the internet, and if you want to build the car yourself in Argentina or Australia, Riversimple won't discourage you, it will help you. And if you think the whole venture just sounds nutty, consider this. The chairman of the Riversimple board and one of the major investors belongs to one of the most distinguished families in the history of the automobile. You may know their brand. It's called Porsche. I'm always interested in the way that wonderful things evolve and what they spring from. You started your career in motorsport, designing and building and restoring racing cars.
Yes, yes.
How did we get from there to here?
Well, before I'd sort of caught motor racing as a sort of disease in my teens, I was actually much more interested in the environment and ecology and so on. And I routinely sort of defended myself over dinner with friends on the basis that motorsport's the quickest and cheapest way of improving the efficiency of cars. Actually, if you that's what motor racing's all about. And once, of course, you make a vehicle more efficient, you can either tune it for speed or you can tune it for outright efficiency. And that's all fine and dandy if you think just making combustion engine cars a little bit better is the answer. But I suppose I reached the conclusion that we needed a step change in technology. We needed to get away from combustion engines altogether. And so prolonging their tenure was no longer a defensible strategy. And I got out not knowing what on earth I was going to do, but I knew it was going to be nothing to do with cars, because the only future for environmentally sustainable cars, I thought, was with better batteries, and that's the realm of big companies, big labs, big budgets, not my sort of world at all. And then I spent a week on a course with Paul Hawken, who you probably know. And Paul told me about fuel cells, which I'd never heard of before at all. And I realised that actually the step change really wasn't at the fuel cell level, making better fuel cells. Sure, there's work to be done there, but the really big step to be made was in the systems integration, putting the whole car together in a different pattern of relationships. And that's what motorsport's all about, and that's my sort of world, and it's small teams of people, it's relatively cheap and it's relatively quick. And so I started, and I very quickly realised that actually the barriers weren't technical, even at that systems integration level. They were all to do with people and politics and business. So while I was doing an MBA treading water, really, I did a study on the commercial feasibility of bringing cars to market.
Fuel cell cars.
Yes, sorry,
yeah,
composite-bodied hydrogen fuel cell cars to market. Yes.
Yeah. Did Amory Lovins play a role in this? Did I read that somewhere?
Yes, well, Paul knew all about fuel cells because of his work with Amory, and so that's what he was citing. And I completely saw the what was so brilliant about Amory's concept. So when I'm talking about hydrogen fuel cell cars, I'm not talking about the cars that are being produced by all the OEMs, really, who are trying to shoehorn fuel cells into the cars and the technology that they already purvey. This is going back to a clean sheet of paper and designing a car for a fuel cell rather than trying to persuade it to behave like a petrol engine, which it doesn't do very well. And that's why all the fuel cell prototypes done by the industry, even in volume runs of 200, are over $1 million a piece, leaving aside the R&D costs. So what they're doing is brilliant. I mean, it's brilliant engineering and so on. And I completely understand why it's the only thing they can do. And it's not because they don't realise what can be done with a clean sheet of paper. It's just that they haven't got a clean sheet of paper. And so I have huge respect for what they're doing, but I don't sympathise enough to wait 40 years for technology that we need now and which we can have now.
When you talk about systems integration, tell me a little bit more about what that means.
Well, a fuel cell doesn't do the same things as a petrol engine. It does some of the same things. It converts a fuel into another form of energy. It is to be regarded as equivalent to an engine in that the size of the fuel cell limits the power of the car. It doesn't limit the range. The range is limited by the tank, a hydrogen tank in this case rather than a petrol tank. But it doesn't have a rotating shaft coming out that can drive the wheels. It just has electricity coming out. And so it's an overlapping but not congruent Venn diagram, if you like. And so you can't take out the petrol engine and put in the fuel cell in its place because it doesn't do the same things. And really you need to change all the pattern of relationships at once. And that dramatically reduces the risks, reduces the barriers, and enables a commercially viable fuel cell car to be produced here and now. And if you think about it, when any radical idea is ever proposed, people think that the prudent way forwards is to change one thing at a time. And that's absolutely true if you're optimizing something. But whenever a radical idea is proposed, the conversation instantly goes straight to all the reasons why it can't be done. And by and large, those reasons are generally true. But they assume that the context within which this radical idea is embedded remains the same. But that whole context, that network, is optimized around an entirely different historic component or idea that is what we've been doing. And if you're prepared to change that whole context, all those connections, which are all the barriers to implementing this radical idea, all those barriers can literally disappear. You've got to design a whole network, a whole context within which that new radical idea does make sense. And it is not practical to try and implement the radical idea incrementally.
So what does this mean in terms of developing a car? What are the things you have to integrate and bring all together?
Right. Well, the principal constraint with fuel cell technology compared with combustion engines is power density. And you simply cannot get remotely the same power density out of a fuel cell that you can get out of a combustion engine. So
let me pause for a second here. Power density.
Power density, the amount of power you can get out of a certain volume. You can get enormous power out of a very small combustion engine nowadays, and you can't out of a fuel cell. And so the Amory Lovin's approach, which he calls hypercar, and his big ideas are the key architectural ideas behind our vehicle design. I think our business model is slightly different because I think that's really where the big barriers lie. But the main features of the vehicle architecture are entirely Amory's. And in our case, we have got 4 electric motors in the 4 wheels. And we've got the fuel cell that provides electricity to drive the motors. And the motors are also brakes, so they generate electricity when you want to slow down, and they charge a bank of ultracapacitors under the seats of the car. And this we call a network hybrid. People talk about a parallel hybrid where you either have an electric motor driving the wheels or a combustion engine, or a series hybrid, that's the Prius, or a series hybrid where a small petrol engine charges batteries which then drive the car. Ours is neither of those. It's a network hybrid in that every component, all the motors and the fuel cell and the ultracapacitors are all connected to each other in a network, and energy can flow on either path in any direction, on any path in either direction, except back into the fuel cell. When you accelerate, the fuel cell actually only provides 20% of the power. 80% comes from the capacitors. And the key thing about that is that you can have a car with the same performance with only 20% of the power. And as I said, power is the real problem of the fuel cell. So that, in one fell swoop, makes a huge difference to the practicality of building a fuel cell car. This can only work if you can rely on the capacitors to provide 80% of the power when you want to accelerate. And consequently, you've got to have very, very efficient braking regen. And the Toyota Prius, for instance, has got regen braking, but at best you'll get about 10% of the kinetic energy of the car recovered when you slow down. In our case, we get at least 50% of the kinetic energy recovered, and when braking hard, it can be as much as 80%. And the key thing about this bit of energy is not that you save a little bit and use it again. The key thing is that you can have a fuel cell 5 times less powerful and still have the same performance. And it's that knock-on effect on the design of the other and sizing of the other components in the system that is the real breakthrough through the regen efficiency. I should probably explain a bit about the cost of fuel cells, because fuel cells are at the moment in the industry prototypes remarkably expensive. It's widely accepted that fuel cells cost pro rata to power. If you want twice the power, it's going to cost you twice as much. Now that's not true of a combustion engine. If you want twice the power of a combustion engine, it's probably going to cost you 5% more. But actually we argue that in the case of fuel cells, it's much, much worse than that. And that's because fuel cells, as well as costing pro rata to power, cost pro rata to power density. So if you want the same power in half the volume, it's going to cost you twice as much. If you want twice the power in your car, your engine bay isn't going to get any bigger. So you also need twice the power density. So that means that your fuel cell is going to cost you 4 times as much. Conversely, if you only want a fifth of the power, as we want, it's going to cost you 25 times less. Now that sounds a terribly glib statement, but as a rule of thumb it sort of works, because our fuel cell in low volume would cost somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000 for the entire system, whereas automotive fuel cells at volumes of 200 are still costing in the region of $1 million a piece. So actually taking the power requirement, reducing the power requirement of a fuel cell has a huge knock-on impact on the commercial viability of hydrogen fuel cell vehicles.
Yeah, and if I understand correctly, the fuel cell is producing a steady quantity of electricity as you go along, but it's being stored in the capacitors, and so you can get the big surge of it out of the capacitors, which then have to get recharged by the regeneration, but also by the fuel cell, right?
Yes, absolutely.
If the regenerative braking isn't doing enough. Yeah.
The fuel cell runs off the hydrogen tank, and it's just electrolysis in reverse. It's instead of putting in water and electricity and getting out hydrogen and oxygen, you put in hydrogen and oxygen, out comes electricity and water. It's much more difficult to make the reaction go that way, but that's all it is. And that then provides the electricity to drive the electric motors. As I said, it only provides about 20% of the power to drive the electric motors. And the capacitors are charged when you brake. But equally, we want the capacitors to be absolutely full when the car's stationary. We want them to be empty when the car's at top speed, because we want somewhere to put the electricity when we slow down. And so we have a map of what sort of state of charge we want the capacitors to be in at any particular speed. Now, when you drive the car very aggressively, you're probably going to be using up more from the capacitors than is being recharged, and so their state of charge will deplete. And so as a consequence, the fuel cell, when it isn't running at full power to drive the electric motors, can be diverted to some of the power going into the capacitors to keep those capacitors at whatever state of charge you want them to be.
It sounds almost like a biological system. It's a little compensation this way and that way, depending on the circumstances that the vehicle's facing.
Well, it is optimized as a whole system. None of these components are optimized as an individual part. And I think it is a true hybrid between all these different components. After all, a hybrid takes the genes of both parents and produces an optimized whole. Whereas what we call hybrids on the road today, to my mind, are really Siamese twins, in that they've got two complete powertrains side by side. You can either run on your combustion engine or on batteries. And that is not an optimized whole system. And essentially, when you're in petrol engine mode, driving on a freeway, you've just got a very heavy car because you're lugging around a battery electric powertrain that you're not using. It's completely redundant. In our system, you can't run, well, you can a bit, but very slowly. You can't really run exclusively on the fuel cell or exclusively on the capacitors. You need the whole system. It is optimized as a whole system.
And what does it produce in terms of emissions?
It just produces water at the point of use, very pure water, and not very much of it either. I mean, if you were to drive from London to Edinburgh, you'd pretty much fill a wine bottle of water. So not an awful lot of water comes out. But it is disingenuous, as some people do, to talk about it as a zero-emission vehicle, because, of course, there is the upstream emissions used in generating the hydrogen first. It's very important not to think of hydrogen as an alternative fuel to petrol or diesel. It's not. You can't dig it out of the ground, you can't pluck it off trees. It's like electricity, it's just an energy carrier. And like electricity, you can generate it from any energy source. Unlike electricity, you can store a large amount in a relatively light container. So it does have, if you make, most hydrogen at the moment is created from natural gas, for instance. And there's huge quantities of hydrogen created and shipped around and used. The technology is well understood, but most of it comes from natural gas because our economic system, of course, doesn't value the externality of the CO2 you create from when you generate that hydrogen. But of course, you can generate hydrogen from completely renewable sources of electricity. And because you can generate it from any source, if you invest in hydrogen vehicle technology and hydrogen infrastructure for distribution of the hydrogen, it does mean that we can rely initially on 100% brown hydrogen, if you like, from natural gas, but you can move seamlessly at any rate you like to green hydrogen without any further investment in the infrastructure or the vehicle technology, without the customer knowing anything about it. I would add, though, that even using hydrogen from natural gas at the moment, our car is less than a third of the emissions of CO2 than of any other car on the market today. So it's about 31 grams per kilometre, the car that we're running at the moment, whereas the lowest emitting car is over 100 grams per kilometre, because the tailpipe figures, the figures that are talked about with cars are actually only the tailpipe figures, and I think the lowest emitting car is 86 grams at the moment, which gives about 103 grams total, because there are some CO2 emissions from extraction of oil, refinery and distribution of the petrol. And tailpipe figures are unfortunately a very, very bad way of comparing these different fuels, because 85% of the CO2 emissions with petrol and diesel, approximately, is downstream, from tank to wheel, comes out the exhaust pipe. Only 15% is upstream. When you're looking at battery electric cars or hydrogen cars, 100% of the emissions are upstream and 0% are downstream. So using the tailpipe is a totally meaningless point at which to analyse the CO2 emissions of these different fuels or different powertrain mediums.
This is kind of like a systems view of the whole process, right? Starting right from the very beginning of the generation of whatever the fuel is, right through to the tailpipe, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and we don't think of it that way.
We don't, unfortunately, no. And so and because all the legislation, the regulatory system is really driving investment in R&D in the auto sector, understandably. But because it is all driven by tailpipe, I would argue that actually it's leading to the investment being focused in completely the wrong direction. For instance, in the UK, you get a £5,000 subsidy for producing a battery electric vehicle. Now, it could be a battery electric Range Rover, for instance. That would be at least 3 tons with all the batteries on board. And very conservatively, that would be a 350 or 400 gram per kilometre car. So, it's not low CO2 and it's not energy efficient. We seem to be totally focused on the CO2 issue at the moment, and we actually have 2 problems that are correlated but not the same. One is CO2 and the other is energy consumption. We have got a real constraint on the amount of renewable energy that we can consume. So just having something that is low CO2 but high energy is no good at all. Now, it's disingenuous, I think, to talk about battery electric or hydrogen electric vehicles as zero emission because there are upstream emissions. But also, it's very easy to get ourselves into a position where we're putting all our investment in something that's zero tailpipe, requires a huge energy input upstream, and ultimately is not going to be low CO2 within our lifetime. Because actually anything that reuses electricity or hydrogen, that demand, if it's put onto the electricity grid, is really going to lead to a marginal increase in the burning of coal. And so it's the burning of coal that is the true measure of the consequences of having the zero emissions at the tailpipe.
To go back to that earlier point about the emissions that you have, even now with brown hydrogen, you're still, what, a third of the emissions of the regular
Yes.
regular car.
Yes.
And if you are able to divide the hydrogen by the use of renewable electricity sources, then you are pretty much 100% emissions free, aren't you?
Absolutely, you can get to, and of course it's much easier to get to 100% emissions free if you're energy efficient as well. Because living sustainably is something that the financial world, every family, let alone company and country, knows it's living off revenue, not capital. The problem is we live in a capital-based transport world, and the beauty of capital is you can draw it down at any rate you like. It just doesn't last forever. Now, this is just as true of natural capital as it is of financial capital. But if we're going to live sustainably, the beauty of revenue is it keeps on going forever, but the rate at which you can draw it down is limited, and therefore energy consumption has got to be the dominant metric that we pursue. And hydrogen is just one element of that, because a kilojoule of hydrogen, we argue, can take you much further than a kilojoule of any other form of energy in a car that's going to have a range of anything over 100 miles. So there's a role for battery electric vehicles, there's a role for biofuels, but please don't try driving from London to Edinburgh on batteries, because it's a very inefficient way of doing so. There are other, obviously, knock-on consequences of moving to hydrogen and its flexibility in what you generate it from, as well as giving you flexibility over time to bring on stream other forms of renewable energy. Then it also gives you a great deal of flexibility regionally to use whatever your local mix of renewable sources is, whilst collaborating on the technology and the infrastructure on a global basis. And of course, renewable forms of energy are much more widely spread and more evenly spread than oil. So there are a number of knock-on effects from that angle as well.
Well, basically you have a vision of a very distributed model of personal transport, right? So you're producing the hydrogen locally from whatever local sources there are. You're also producing the car locally in very small shops too, right?
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. Yes, I'm very clear that just as houses are location specific, vehicles should be location specific. Now, at the moment, the industry is driven by the weird economics of pressed steel. There is no conspiracy. I understand the position that they're in. There's huge pressure on margins and the cost of vehicles. And if you only make 1 million cars, you're much better off combining with somebody else who makes another 1 million cars, because your unit cost comes down. But it leads to the world car that's tested in the Arctic Circle and in Death Valley. But in reality, people don't drive from the Arctic Circle to Death Valley. And it leads to a huge amount of redundancy in the capability of the car that leads to excess cost, excess consumption of materials, excess consumption of energy. And actually, if we are to build a car for Portugal, we wouldn't take a car that we've designed for the UK and fit aircon and sell it in Portugal, because the aircon system would use more energy than the vehicle would. You've absolutely got to design a vehicle with aircon as part of the brief from the word go, and design a different vehicle. If you move away from pressed steel as your structural material, you don't have that driver to constantly to head towards the world car concept, the one size fits all. And you can genuinely design cars that suit different environmental conditions, different road conditions, different cultural conditions. All those things should be factored in to the sort of vehicle you make. And certainly there will remain a global supply chain of components, but you don't have to use a common platform for vehicles in every part of the world if you move away from steel to composite materials.
This actually sounds a little bit like the computer industry, where every little shop can make a different kind of computer for the customer who comes in and says, well, I need to do this and this and this, but not that. Mm-hmm.
I suppose the key point is that there is a minimum efficient scale that we recognise. It's just that minimum efficient scale of a model of car comes down from sort of 300,000 units per annum to about 5,000, about 2 orders of magnitude. So it is, even with computers, if you customise to that extent, it is going to be more expensive than having the one-size-fits-all solution. In our case, we're saying that the economic costs bottom out at that sort of level. So you can genuinely design something and build something that is specific to niches, functional niches as well as regional niches, and be competitive with a one-size-fits-all solution as well.
And that's by getting those production units down to that smaller size. And now that's, well, before we get too far away from the fuel issue too, I wanted to ask you, what's the how would your car compare with the others in terms of mileage, if that's even a meaningful phrase in this context?
In mileage and range, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, in range, I should say that our car is designed for local use. I'll come on to that in a minute. And we've got a range of 240 miles. Now, a car for local use, that's a week's use of fuel. There's actually no real problem in designing the car for a longer range than that. It's just that we don't need to for the niche that we are targeting initially. The industry does have a real problem with hydrogen storage. You may well be alluding to that. And in some quarters, I think it is regarded as the key barrier to having hydrogen fuel cell cars. And at the moment, they've got 3 barriers. That's hydrogen storage density, the fuel cell power density I was talking about, and the fuel cell cost. The problem that the industry faces in adopting an incremental strategy, which they have to do because they're very, very good at what they do, but they can't throw it all away and start again. They can't take the clean sheet of paper approach. They have to plot an incremental path forwards from where they are. And fuel cell power density is a real barrier, so the fuel cell needs an awful lot of technology thrown at it to achieve that power density. That, unfortunately, is pulling in the opposite direction to your driver to reduce cost because it makes the fuel cell more expensive. But the third problem they have is hydrogen storage density. And the end result of this car is actually not terribly efficient. So you need a lot of hydrogen to store, and you can't squeeze a lot of hydrogen into a small volume. So all these three factors are pulling you in different directions. It's a tug of war. And at the moment, the industry prototypes are doing about 40 miles per kilo of hydrogen, which is equivalent to about 40 miles per gallon, per US gallon of petrol. Very similar energy content. Our car does 240, well, it's just under 200 miles per US gallon. It's about 200 miles per US gallon. Now, if you lob that factor of 5 into the equation, the solution of using less hydrogen is a much easier way through the problem than storing more hydrogen in a smaller volume. The only solution that you can adopt, the only solutions you can in an incremental strategy are to throw more money at the basic science, increase the fuel cell power density, the hydrogen storage density. We're saying if you take a whole system approach designing a car for a fuel cell, all those problems go away. So I completely accept that those problems are very real and exist for the auto industry. The only disingenuous bit is that I don't believe that they're true in any absolute sense. They're solving problems entirely of their own creation.
Because, so what you really have is an attempt to adapt an old situation to a totally new context, and
absolutely,
yeah, very difficult to do. But the solution, for part of the solution, is surely the extreme lightness of the car that you're like. You don't need a huge amount of energy to drive a car at the weight that you're building them, right?
There's a virtuous circle of a number of connected factors. The fact that we're using carbon fibre, it's lighter, so you need less power. The fact that you have very efficient regen braking, so you can get away with a much smaller fuel cell. If you can have a smaller fuel cell, it's much lighter. Now, the weight of a car is largely driven by the need to keep it safe keep people safe in accidents, and that means hanging on to the heavy bits when you do have an accident. If the heavy bits get lighter, you can have a lighter structural weight and still have a safe vehicle. If you make the structural weight lighter, it means you need less power in the first place. So you have these mass decompounding cycles where you can have a yet smaller fuel cell, smaller electric motors, fewer ultracapacitors. So all these things feed together. I would say that it goes beyond just the design of the vehicle, though, to the design of the whole business model as well, because just as the modern motor car, brilliant though it is optimized around combustion engines, the whole business model of the auto industry has been forged by the 20th century. And the constraints that we face in the 21st century are things like energy security, CO2 emissions, peak oil. These are the really big major constraints we face, and they simply were not on the radar in the 20th century. So you can't expect the business model of the 20th century to be very well suited to dealing with the 21st century. And as with the motor car and the design of the motor car, it's much easier, we believe, to design a business model to deal with the 21st century than to try and tweak something that was designed to do something fundamentally different. Now, in our case, probably one of the key features is to move from selling cars as a product to selling mobility as a service. With Riversimple, we will never sell a car. We will only sell you a service contract, much like a mobile phone. And you sign up for a period of, say, 2 years, and you pay on a monthly direct debit with a fixed price element per month and a variable bit per mile. It'd be something like 10 cents per mile or whatever. And that covers all your costs. So everything is bundled into that. Obviously there's the depreciation, all the servicing, maintenance, all the tyres, but also, and things like insurance, but also, very specifically, the fuel. So when you fill up with hydrogen, you'll use a smart card, but the bill comes to us, not to you. That completely changes all the brief for the designers of the vehicle. Because if you're selling cars, you're rewarded for obsolescence and high running costs, and that's what you make your money from. You need to keep product going out of the door, and you make money from the maintenance of the vehicle in the field. In our case, though, our interest is in longevity and low running costs, because we want the car to last as long as possible out in the field. It doesn't mean we want you to keep it as long as possible. After the 2 years is up, you can have a new car if you want it, give the car back to us. But we want to have as much life left in the car as possible because we're going to lease it to a second, third, fourth hand customer. And as the car gets older, the fixed price element will go down and down and down. The variable bit, the 10 cents per mile, will stay the same because it's not 10 cents, it's about 20 cents per mile is what we're looking at. And it completely changes the design choices that we will make, because we're responsible for whole life costs. It is in our interest for the car to be as efficient as possible. The carbon fibre is a very good example of this, in that routinely I'm told that you'll never be able to bring carbon fibre into mainstream segments of the market. It's going to remain only in the premium segments because it can never compete on price with steel. Now, I've even seen carbon fibre compared with steel in the cost per kilo, which is a pretty bizarre metric because you don't buy your car by the kilo, but you buy it by the car. But even if leaving that aside, if you look at the vehicle, you make a car out of carbon fibre, it's lighter, you have some capital cost savings because you've got a lighter car, so you need a smaller fuel cell, fewer ultracapacitors, smaller electric motors. But then, even that is not a complete understanding of the issue, because you need to then step back and look at the whole business model. So, in our business model, we're responsible for the lifetime costs, including all the fuel. If we make a carbon fibre car, we're going to make a car that's much more efficient. And even leaving aside the capital cost savings I've already mentioned, we will save more money on the hydrogen through a 15-year life of the vehicle than the premium we pay for the carbon fibre. That means that we can make more profit out of a carbon fibre car than we can out of a steel car at the same price to the customer. Now that really is a very substantial competitive advantage, and it hints at one of the great features of this business model. It allows us to bring new low carbon vehicle technologies to market before mainstream auto can bring them to market. A motor manufacturer cannot bring a fuel cell to market until effectively it's the same price cost to them as a petrol engine. Otherwise, they simply can't be competitive in this very tight, very competitive market. For us, because we can bring a car to market that's much more efficient, we can afford to invest much more in the technology up front, so we can bring the fuel cell to market long before it's competitive with the petrol engine, because of the lifetime costs ending up being lower for us. And it allows us to bring these things to market before they've reached the equivalent cost.
It's a fascinating business model, and I suspect it's applicable to a great many products. Because really, I mean, as a customer, I don't want a car, I want the use of a car. Yes, and that's exactly what you're selling me.
It also allows us to take a much more rational view of what to design and what the customer wants. We know that people discount future costs very, very heavily. And industry knows that the customer will never pay for the real benefit of something that's more energy efficient or longer lasting. And white goods manufacturers, for instance, have understood this increasingly over the years. Fridge life has been going down and down because people will never pay for the real benefit of a longer lasting fridge. In the case of cars, it hasn't really, fuel consumption hasn't made a serious impact on the design of cars because of this. And in fact, we've got a slide of two VW Beetles from the same company, one from 1948 and one from 2008. Both cars, 60 years apart, both cars from the same company, they both do 38 mpg. Now, you've got to remember, I mean, of course, they're not like for like. The modern Beetle is a more comfortable, faster and safer car. But nonetheless, you would expect more progress than that, especially when you remember that less than halfway through that period, in 1973, came the oil crisis. And so I think you have to accept that progress hasn't been spectacular on fuel consumption. And in this case, when you go to a sale or service model, because we're looking at the whole lifetime costs, we internalize and capture all 100% of the economic benefits of longevity and efficiency. It means that we can make an entirely rational economic decision on what is the cheapest way of delivering that service for the customer for as long as possible. Because we can afford to take that economic decision in a way that we know the customer never will. So it profoundly changes the relationship, because it aligns our interests with the customer. Our interest and the customer's interest is shared in what is the cheapest way of delivering that service for 15 years. Whereas at the moment, the interests of a manufacturer and a seller of vehicles are completely opposed to the interests of the consumer, because the manufacturer wants the car to be as expensive as possible and the customer to keep it as short a time as possible, and actually be as high maintenance and unreliable as possible, because all that makes money. Now, it sounds terribly contentious, and you can't make a highly unreliable car because the customer will go to one of your competitors. But all your competitors at the moment have those same financial drivers. It's obsolescence and high running costs is where you make your money, and that is the polar opposite of the interests of the consumer. And bringing your interests and the consumer's interests into alignment is just a much more stable basis for building a business.
And it's a basis, as we said earlier, that could apply not just to cars, but to many, many other aspects of the economy. You know?
I think it's fair to say that in every aspect of life now, we are seeing peak resource issues biting. And if your model rewards resource consumption, and we're trying to reduce consumption, that is a vulnerable place to be. Far better to have a business model that rewards resource efficiency rather than resource consumption. But you can't bet on exactly what's going to happen in the future, but you can very clearly identify the major trends. And the trends are towards resource depletion and consequent regulatory pressure to reduce consumption of resources. And actually, if your business model is rewarded by the throughput of resources, maximising the throughput of resources, it puts you in a very, very weak position, and a brittle position as this world unfolds.
You've also taken a different attitude towards the proprietary technology, and in fact, rather than holding it to yourselves and patenting it and making it difficult to emulate, you encourage people to emulate it, right, through an open source licensing policy. Tell me about that, because that's another big piece of this business model, isn't it?
Well, we think the vehicles we're talking about are much better than the vehicles that are made by current OEMs, and we completely accept that it's not practical for them to do what we're doing. As a consequence, if we try and be the next Ford or GM, we're going to get into a huge standards war, because we're talking about different materials, different sorts of fuel cells, different sorts of electric motors. All these standards are different to what the industry is developing. And if we get into a standards war, we'll lose, no matter how much better our cars are. So our biggest risk is not appealing to the customer or finding a market, because the market is absolutely huge and is crying out for more efficient and cleaner cars. Our biggest risk is a standards war, and the surest way of avoiding a standards war is to give away the recipe for making money from making cars. Because, I mean, there was a CEO at Frankfurt a couple of years ago who was saying there isn't a single person on the planet currently making money from making cars. It is a very, very tricky area to be in at the moment. And if you give away a recipe for a business model and a technology that is more profitable, it's reasonable to expect that entrepreneurs will appear who will take up your offer. The advantage for us is standards becoming more widely supported, different materials, different crash repair, but particularly building volume in our supply chains, because if other people start using the same sort of fuel cells, same sort of electric motors, our supply chain costs are going to come down. And I think that you could actually argue that the two biggest barriers to new entrants in the auto sector over the last few decades have been the extraordinarily low supply chain costs that the industry currently enjoys, and their established distribution channels. And it's very difficult for somebody to come in and challenge that. If you go an open source route and you have a large number of generic rather than mark-specific components, it means that you can build volume in your supply chain even though you're a small company, and you can expect independent companies to emerge who will support all vehicles using those standards. Because it isn't a Riversimple electric motor, it's an electric motor designed for one of these cars. And if you have wide acceptance of the interface standards, so things are not, so all your components aren't mark specific, then it means that we're absolved for the responsibility of having distribution and servicing in every location where the vehicle is. We can work with independent field supporters who, independent companies who will provide the field support for any vehicles using these standards.
I see. Yes, of course. So if you're using a certain kind of standardized electric motor, yeah, you don't have to have a Riversimple supply or repairman in Buenos Aires. You've got somebody there who's making the Buenos Aires equivalent of your car and has the same components in it.
Yes.
Again, rather like the computer industry, right? I mean, where the processes are similar. Yeah.
And the auto industry used to be a bit more like this too. I mean, in the old days, if you had a Morris Minor or an Aston Martin, you still had the same Lucas headlight. But nowadays, a Peugeot 306 headlight won't fit a Peugeot 406.
Yes, yeah. So. Have you had much uptake in terms of people being interested in taking up the implied offer in the open source model?
Oh yes, we've had huge support. We've rather prematurely launched, set up a website. We never launched it openly, but people found it. And we've got a list of over 400 really remarkably varied and talented individuals who are all offering to support. But we aren't at the stage where we can upload a significant amount of material. I mean, we're very resource constrained, and I would like to think that by late next year we'll be in a position where there'll be a substantial amount up there. But we've had an extraordinary array of skills offered, and you might expect there to be a large amount of proportion of time-wasting, sort of willing but not very skilled enthusiasts subscribing. I'd say that over 90% of these people have identifiable and demonstrable skills that are relevant to what we want to do.
It's not right.
It's been fantastic, yes.
That's huge.
And that's without launching it officially.
Yes, just people sort of nosing it out and
yes,
saying, this looks interesting.
And it varies from electronics and systems design and composites through to technical illustration, you name it. I mean, it's a huge range of expertise.
Another aspect of your philosophy is a really quite remarkable corporate structure in a sense of the people to whom you're responsible. Tell me about that.
Yes, well, I originally set this company up to work towards delivering sustainable transport, and it became very clear to me when I started thinking about where the money was going to come from that different sorts of money has different rights and responsibilities, and corporate governance was very important if the organisation was to remain true to its purpose. And by the way, the purpose of Riversimple, which we spent a number of years refining, is to work systematically towards the elimination of the environmental impact of personal transport.
Now, say that again, because I think that's an absolutely key piece of this. What is it?
Yes, and we thought long and hard about every word in that purpose statement. It's to work systematically towards the elimination of the environmental impact of personal transport. Now, there are two key words there. One is the elimination, which sounds a very, very bold ambition, and it is. And we know it's bold, but it's to just reduce the environmental impact of personal transport is an insufficient goal if you want to build a sustainable future, because being less unsustainable is still not sustainable. And it's all too easy to go a route where if we do this it would halve the CO2 emissions, but if it's never going to get to zero, it's never something that you can develop into a sustainable system. So you've got to have a bigger, more ambitious long-term goal than that, which is elimination, and then backcast a strategy from that as to how you got there. Because it's a long way out, the other key word in the statement is systematically. We know we're not going to get there overnight, but we've got to make sure that every step we take moves us towards that end goal, rather than off on a tangent. If you imagine a tree, and the crown of the tree is where we're trying to get to. If you forecast from the bottom where you are now, you can very easily go off on a branch and invest in something that reduces environmental impact, but has no hope of ever being sustainable. And dead ends like that are really bad news for two reasons. One is, of course, you don't get to where you're trying to get to, and B, you've got to write off the investment you made getting to the wrong place and start all over again. But the danger is that forecasting from where you are it allows you to fall into many such traps. And the only way to make sure that you don't make your investments unwisely is to backcast from this future point, which is defined by that purpose statement. To make sure that the business stays true to that purpose, you have to have a more sophisticated governance system than one that is designed to maximize the interests of investors. Because we regard limited liability as a huge privilege that is granted by society, and it was granted by society to enable things that could be done in the interest of society that couldn't be done by individuals. And gradually, case law has refined that purpose to embed the primacy of shareholder value. And in a world where our economic system is so riddled with externalities, the interests of shareholders are simply not the same as the interests of society. And to suggest they are, I think, is very naive. Now, what we've done, we believe, and we've worked very closely with our key investors, is actually is in the interests of investors as well as society. And it's not to say that we're a not-for-profit organisation or a social enterprise that is trading return for environmental and social returns. We think that this model is in the interest of investors and will give a much more profitable and more resilient investment. The key reason is that we've identified 6 key stakeholder groups, all of whom are critical to the success of the business. But if you subordinate the interests of 5 of those stakeholder groups to the interests of 1, you can't expect to harness the goodwill or maximize the goodwill of the other 5. And the purpose of really running a business well has got to be to maximize the goodwill of all those stakeholders who have an impact on the success of the business. So we have a fiduciary responsibility in our operating board to balance and protect the benefit streams of those 6 stakeholder groups. If you harness the goodwill of those 6 stakeholder groups, you will have a more successful business. Doesn't mean that the money is split 6 ways. By and large, in our organisation, the money in terms of distributions goes the same way, and in a mature business, the bulk of distributions would go to investors. But the paradox is that if you want that investment in a much more sustainable business, it's going to be sustainably profitable, it's going to be resilient in the face of future trends, it's going to have embedded in it a much better long-term decision-making capacity. The paradox is that you have to resign control because it depends on it being a partnership, and you can't have a partnership in which one partner's in control. But actually, investors aren't after control. We think of control and investment as being indivisible. That's historically become the case, but actually there's no reason why it should be the case. And the reason why the control there is to protect investment, and quite understandably. I don't actually think personally that in the current corporate system that's all pervasive, that investors' interests are very well protected. But we've gone to great lengths to provide alternative and we think better mechanisms for investors to protect their investment than by being in control. And so it's a virtuous system in which we believe the investors will get a better return in a much more resilient business that won't suffer from, will never get itself into big environmental disasters that BP, for instance, have demonstrated. Our organisation would never be able to get into that territory. It will have much better labour relations because the staff in the business are owners. It doesn't just mean their voices are heard as stakeholders and then the boardroom doors are closed and the decision made in the interest of shareholders. But all these bodies have a voice. It doesn't mean, equally, that it's a talking shop, because there's still an operating board that has all the agility and mandate of a normal board to pursue the purpose of the business. But there are routes of appeal for any stakeholder, and particularly for investors, through a stewards board, which is not a supervisory board. It's like an upper and a lower house in government. It's a balancing body that monitors the performance of the operating board as the operating board monitors the stewards board. And if there's any tangible reason to believe that the operating board are not pursuing their fiduciary responsibility of balancing and protecting the benefit streams of the stakeholders, then the stewards board has the power to intervene.
Who are the six? The six sets of stakeholders?
The 6 stakeholder groups that are represented in the governance of the organisation are 1, the investors, 2, the environment, 3, the staff, 4, the users of the vehicles, 5 is the commercial partners, so suppliers and infrastructure providers, and 6 we call neighbours. They're all bodies who have no direct commercial relationship with the business, so local government who are interested in employment, bodies interested in road safety or air quality.
How does the environment get represented on the board? The trees aren't going to vote for a representative.
Well, the environment, I should point out, none of these bodies are represented on the board. The majority of the board is elected as a slate by the 6 custodian bodies. So they elect a slate of 5 people. They purposely do not elect a slate of 6, because then they would each be proposing their representative. If you do that, you embed confrontation as the principal dynamic in the board, because everybody's there to fight their corner. It's up to the custodians to agree a slate of 5 and agree that in balance all their interests are sufficiently represented by the balance of that slate. And you're embedding in that system cooperation as the fundamental dynamic, because if you dig your heels in, all you guarantee is stasis. The board can do what it's like, the board becomes self-electing, and nobody has a power of veto. Everybody has to work with other bodies in order to implement any change. And but back to your question of who represents the environment, we are handing out, we want these 6 custodian bodies representing the 6 key stakeholders to be to become autonomous eventually, but not in the early days. We know we're working with quite a very novel form of structure. We think it is much more elegant and self-regulating than the conventional structure, and we've got a lot of self-regulating and balancing loops that will keep it much truer to purpose. But we know we're going to have to tweak and refine it as we go forward. So we're not handing complete control out to all the custodian bodies straight away. At the moment, the environmental custodian is represented by a Green Party member activist who we have got to know over the last 2 years very well. He is very much his own man. He is not going to sort of accept what we say and compromise his own position. I would argue he's actually got more at stake than any of the other representatives, because he's a man who's never earned a great deal of money, and all he has got is his reputation. He's never gone close to a car company, and if this blows up in his face, his reputation will be in tatters. But nonetheless, he understands our long-term purpose well enough to be a very constructive person to work with as we refine this business model. We would like it to be all these custodian bodies will be represented by more people as the business grows, but we don't want to make it too cumbersome too quickly.
This is a very exciting venture in terms of your kind of inventing it, making it up as you go along, finding ways for the values that you start with to be embedded in the vehicle, the company, the whole governance structure, and your relationships with the world, right? They're all.
Yes.
You're making it all up. Almost.
Well, we're making it all up, but there's an awful lot of models for everything that we've got. We've taken an awful lot of lessons from a number of different quarters. So our governance model, for instance, is hugely influenced by Visa, and particularly by an American called Joel Getzendanner, who worked with Dee Hock in the 1990s, who's the man who set up Visa. And Joel has got the most incisive understanding of corporate governance issues that I know of. But there's a lot of lessons from employee-owned organisations like John Lewis in the UK, from the Basque cooperative called Mondragon. A lot of elements of these organisations we've implemented in what we're doing, and we have been working on it for 10 years, and it hasn't been easy. But we do think that we've, by and large, got the basic structural feedback loops right. The bits we're going to have to carry on working with are the bits around the edges of the process and how these processes actually work. But the structural loops we feel are right and self-reinforcing, whereas I think that some of the, and we are addressing some very fundamental problems in a conventional limited liability corporation, where the unitary system has embedded a number of conflicts of interest, and there is no mechanism analogous to checks and balances to correct it. And at the moment, the study of corporate governance, I think, by and large, is very constrained by a mandate to try and make existing corporations a little bit less, deal with some of the flaws in existing corporations.
That's very diplomatically put, but I think a lot of people, and a lot of environmentalists will have come to some variant of the view that the problems are fundamentally the irresponsibility of limited liability corporations. And you really are trying to address something that goes right to the root of that, no?
I think that, yes, and I am trying diplomatically to say that I don't think that academics even in the field have the mandate to look at the elephant in the room, or the various elephants in the room. You don't have a mandate to go back to fundamental structural problems that are that limit the ability, well, they just make it impossible to align the interests of society with the interests of organisations without existing players giving up various rights, and that isn't going to happen. So I don't see any way in which we can get back to the original moral justification for a limited liability corporation was, as I was saying, to do things in the interest of society that can't be done by individuals. And if you think about it, why would society grant a privilege to a small group of individuals, i.e. investors, without any quid pro quo? The reason is that it's got to be doing something in the interest of society. And that bit, I think, has been lost. I don't see that ensuring that what the company does is in the interest of society is in any way incompatible with the shareholders' interests. And in fact, I think that if you embed the voices of all the other critical stakeholders, you will force upon the system a much sounder, longer-term decision-making process that is in the interests of the investors as well.
Do you foresee yourself becoming a public company at some point in the future?
We won't say never. And we honestly haven't done enough work on this yet to really give you a proper answer. We have real concerns about the influence of highly liquid stock on the behaviour of the company. We don't think it's impossible, but and actually, in many respects, our corporate governance system is probably more able to resist the short-termism that's forced upon companies than a conventional company. But nonetheless, it would be a big step for us to take, and something that we do talk about, but we've got too many other things on our plate to have really addressed the problem properly.
Yeah, and I didn't think you probably would have at this point, but it's interesting because, I mean, to deal with this, the solution of Yvon Chouinard at Patagonia is simply not to ever take the company public. He owns it.
Yes.
He runs it responsibly. He runs it very carefully and with a real sense of where he is in the world and what companies should and should not be doing. And I don't think he sees any way of protecting that if the company went private, which is what really prompted me to ask the question.
Yes. You know? I've read his book and I have huge respect for him. I think he's done a blinding job of sort of pioneering this territory. He's somebody I should have mentioned already as being an influence. But what we're trying to do is build something that's generically applicable, and anything that relies on altruism or the benevolent dictator, to my mind, is not a system, because it's vulnerable when that individual has gone, or you get the wrong individual in the situation. We're trying to build a system that makes all of us and myself completely dispensable. And if it relies, for example, on me to stick true to the purpose of the organisation, we've failed. So I understand his concern. If we build in robust structure and processes into our organisation to remain true to purpose, it's not impossible it could be, because I don't think that it would be available. For instance, if we were to have a hostile takeover, somebody could buy 100% of the stock in the business. They can't actually change the purpose of the business without the agreement of the other 5 custodians. And I don't think, for instance, that you get the environment or neighbours to agree to something that changes the purpose away from this fundamental thing of providing a service without the damage.
Let me just project a little into the future now, because this has obviously been, you've been fording a very deep river. It's actually a set of very deep rivers here, and I gather that the timetables have slipped a little bit. That you intended by 2012 to be running pilot projects in Leicester and here in Shropshire.
Yeah.
Now 2 years away. I think this is terrifically exciting. I'd love to own a Riversimple car. How long before I might have a chance to do that, do you think?
Well, of course, you'll never technically own one.
see how deeply embedded, I know that, and see how deeply embedded that concept is.
Yes. Yeah. We even have to try and avoid using the term lease. I still use it sometimes, but because we're not even leasing the cars, really, because people think, when you say that, people understand what you're talking about. They think they know what you're talking about. And of course, what we're doing is completely different to the way vehicles are leased at the moment, which is simply a means of encouraging demand when economic circumstances get a bit soft, and keep the product moving out the door. We're doing it for completely different reasons and in a different way, so it yields a completely different outcome. So we try and avoid the word lease. But anyway,
what word do you use?
Selling service. We're selling mobility as a service rather than a car as a product.
So how long until I can buy the service?
Well, we hope to have our production car, our production prototype we're working on now, running by the end of next year, end of 2013, and be running those pilots in 2014, and starting production in 2015. But it will be location specific. So, for instance, I have talked about the fact there's a local car. This is quite another quite important element of the whole programme, in that I think when you go through technology disruptions, an awful lot of things change that are not obviously going to happen. But in the history of sort of disruptive innovations, one of the key side effects has been that it creates new markets, or at the very least the segmentation of markets changes. And I believe that that's going to happen with cars. So we're identifying a market segment the industry doesn't recognise, which is the local car, which doesn't mean an urban car, for instance. I mean, the Smart is an urban car. It's targeted specifically at cities. But we're saying there's a demand for a local car, and that can just as easily be rural as urban. So we're doing one trial in Leicester, in an urban trial, and a rural trial here where we are in Herefordshire and Shropshire. But there's a number of people who don't go outside a 25-mile radius. I mean, that's a 50-mile dam, which is quite a big patch. And there are a number of people who don't go outside that area. There's a number of people who, if they do, would go by train. And there's a number of people like myself who have a second car that never goes outside that area. I think that with the change from the way that the world is going and the pressure that energy consumption is going to force upon us, we are going to have to adopt a multitude of different powertrains and fuels, pick off different niches, different solutions. And there's a role for batteries, as I said, there's a role for hydrogen, there's a role for biofuels. But there will be some functional segmentation. At the moment, the segmentation of the market, A, B, C, D segments, etc., is basically on the base of price and size, and they're very closely correlated. But there's no functional segmentation, and they can all drive at least 300 miles on motorways at the road legal maximum. And it's a one-size-fits-all solution. Petrol engines are very versatile. They do everything inefficiently, but it allows people to buy the one-size-fits-all car. Unfortunately, people might buy a Volvo estate because they want to go on holiday in France for a couple of weeks every summer with their family, but then spend 48 weeks of the year commuting, one person in his Volvo estate, through traffic jams into cities. And with the rise of car sharing, the success we're having in Europe, at least, at modal shift, getting people onto trains for longer journeys, the focus on localization and better planning, I think it gets to the point where it is easier for people to buy their car, or contract, in our case, a car that's going to cover 90%, 95% of their needs, and deal with the 5% with a different car they have access to occasionally, rather than having to have the car that does 100%. So the local car is, I think, a very big segment. It will be much cheaper, much more appropriate, and more fit for purpose in every respect, and better for the customer than any of the one-size-fits-all solutions. And through these other mechanisms, they can pick off the other 5% of requirements in another way. The reason we've chosen this segment initially is that if you build a hydrogen car, there's a chicken and egg that people have talked about. True with battery cars as well, of who's going to put in the infrastructure before there are cars, who's going to build the cars before there's the infrastructure. And if in the UK you'd launch a hydrogen car, there's going to be a critical mass of hydrogen filling stations that you need. It's going to be in the hundreds before you have a commercial market for your vehicle. If you launch a local car and you site that local station intelligently, the critical scale of infrastructure to create a commercial market for the car is one filling station. Now, it's a small commercial market, but as long as people in that area have a reason to go through that hub point where you've located the filling station once a week, then they're viable customers for you for this vehicle. Bringing the critical scale of infrastructure down from hundreds to one is obviously a huge breakthrough in the case to speculate on bringing this to market. But it's also got a much stronger argument, totally changes the investment case for the gas company who's going to make the infrastructure investment, because we're not going to make that. And that's because they can speculate at the scale of one station, see if the model works. All the cars we make are concentrated around one filling station, so there's much more throughput of hydrogen, so it'll wash its face commercially much quicker anyway. They can increase their market in increments, but each increment of market that they create is a separate commercial investment case, rather than pouring yet more speculative money into the same thing. And it expands our market in increments, and it allows us incrementally to build the skeleton of a nationwide network, at which point we can launch an intercity capable car.
And you see that as being not that far off, actually, right? You think the intercity car?
No, I don't.
Years,
I think the gas companies we're very close to, and they are, they almost get irritated by the question of the infrastructure problem, because they say, look, there's no problem. As long as somebody wants the gas, we can do it. And if you give them an investment case where they can put this in small increments, and you prove it, they will make the investment very quickly once you've proven the model. And the last point I should make, actually, is that because our car does over 200 miles per kilo of hydrogen, it means that we're using much less hydrogen, which might seem like a bad thing for the people who are going to provide the hydrogen. But of course, it means they can charge much more for the hydrogen, and it can still be cheaper for us per mile than petrol. So on a calorific equivalent, to be an equivalent price per kilojoule, hydrogen would have to be just over £5 a kilo. But to be the same price as a car that does 50 mpg in the UK, which is what, sort of 45, it's a 40 US mpg, to be the same price per mile, we could pay £30 a kilo rather than £5 a kilo, and it's still equivalent. Now that completely changes the investment case for the gas company. I'm not saying we want to pay £30 a kilo at all, and I don't think we will be, but we certainly don't mind paying more than £10 a kilo.
I was going to say maybe not 30, but maybe 15, which would be very, very rich from the gas company's point of view, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, very attractive. And I love the idea of the local becoming, in a sense, it's almost like a web that builds itself out from starting from one station to the next, to the next, to the next, and ultimately you turn around and you say, I built my own boat one time, and my experience of building the boat was never that I was building a boat, it was always that I was putting this piece, shaping that piece, fastening these two things together, and then one day I went out of the shop and I looked back and the thing looked like a boat. You know, and I sensed this could be very much a similar experience.
Absolutely, and it's always meant to be the dictum if you're climbing Everest. Just focus on the next step. And but I think we are taking we are having to be very patient, because we are looking a long way ahead. But we're trying to build a strategy, or we have tried to build a strategy, and we think we've got a pretty good one, that A, reduces the risks, B, reduces the barriers, and third, C, reduces the increments of speculation required in order to generate a commercial revenue stream. Because the key to this really taking off and spreading like wildfire is commercial revenue. And no amount of speculative money, I believe, is enough, will be enough to crack this huge problem. But if you can find a niche whereby all the actors in the system, in the network, are generating commercially profitable revenues, that will be, you'll generate the capital to drive growth much, much easier. And if you look at the history of disruptive technologies, it has always started in a niche where the weaknesses of the new technology And as I said, with power density, fuel cells do have a weakness compared with petrol engines, where the weaknesses don't matter too much, and where the strengths are highly valued. And then, because it's an immature technology, there's an S-curve of technology development. And when you're right down at the bottom, once you generate a commercial revenue stream, you're on the steep bit, where the technology improves very, very rapidly. Our competition is right up on the plateau here. It's incredibly highly optimized technology. And so, as with all disruptive technologies, we expect to be able to start off in a niche that's below the radar of the industry. It's too small a niche for the industry to be terribly interested in. But as you generate commercial revenue and the technology improves and the scale of the market increases and the capital at your disposal increases, the technology will move up into it through the mainstream segments. Now, one of the advantages of being a startup is you can focus on a niche that's too small for the dominant players in the market. And this is always the case. It doesn't matter whether you look at excavators or hard disk drives, and the case studies are numerous. But it is critical to generate these early market revenue opportunities. And if you don't, it is just a huge speculative gamble to try and come in at the mainstream end of the market with a technology that's fundamentally not up to scratch. But that is what the industry has to do. And so all the fuel cell prototypes coming out of Honda and Daimler-Benz and GM and so on are aiming to replace like with like. They're trying to produce a car that is capable of doing everything that you expect of a petrol engine car at a commercially viable equivalent price. And that just flies in the face of how disruptive technologies ever come to market. I know it's a brave investment, and I'm not suggesting that they in their position can do anything other than that. All I'm saying is that it's a very inefficient, ineffective and challenging way to bring this technology to market.
And it emphasizes the strength of the small, the nimble, the clean sheet of paper. That becomes a huge set of advantages. Right?
Absolutely, yes it does.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think, as you sort of alluded to in passing, there's a whole package of cultural changes that this goes along with too. I mean, people saying, I want small local food, I want small local housing, I want optimized, things that are on a very local scale, and now all of a sudden here's the transportation equivalent of the farmer's market. In effect,
absolutely,
right?
Absolutely, and as a small company, we don't need all these cultural shifts to happen all at once, but they are happening. They're moving in our direction, and I don't. If you look at the attitudes, how the attitudes to SUVs changed in a sort of 2-year period. And there was never any sort of concern about them, and they became vilified within a couple of years over here in Europe. Things do change, and they don't. It's not a steady continuum. It's a punctuated equilibrium. We have step changes, but the fact that you're small, it doesn't matter if 99% of the market isn't interested in what you're after. If 1% is, and you're serving it, you're producing a much more persuasive offer than anybody else. That is more than enough for us to establish a foothold in the market. And there will be people who will, till their dying day, will want to own their car, to the point of legal ownership, title deed belongs to me, and they're not our core customer base. But there's time for these things, these shifts to happen, and increasingly we are buying things as services rather than product. And it's becoming much more widespread. So I think that there's a number of different cultural issues, and yes, there will be those who adopt them more readily and more quickly than others. But we will grow as these shifts happen.
That's wonderful. It's lovely to see something like this as a small plant, and see the potential for it to become a very, as you said, you referred to the possibility of spreading like wildfire. I can imagine that. I think that's quite possible.
I think essentially the only way to to get the level of change that we require. There is a gulf between where we are with transport and where we need to get to. And the only way to implement this change, I understand all the inertial issues that the industry faces, but I've long since sort of given up any idea that you change the regulatory environment to force people to do it or anything like that. The only way is, as Buckminster Fuller said, you change things, you don't fight the existing reality, you build a better model that makes the existing model obsolete. And in this case, the critical thing is to make more money. Actually, if the model is more profitable, then it will take off. And at the moment, the auto segment is very, very highly geared, very, very small margins. The vast majority of their costs are fixed, very low variable costs, very incapable of dealing with fluctuating demand in the market. All in all, it's a very brittle system, and it has got no obvious answers to the pressures over energy consumption and climate change. And so if you can build a model that is more profitable and more nimble and agile than that, that is the surest way to get change, and the regulators will follow.
Hugo Spowers of Riversimple, a company in the small English town of Ludlow, which seeks to create a truly sustainable automobile industry. If you enjoyed this interview, you may want to watch our interviews on energy with David Hughes and Jeff Rubin, or our interview about green business with Andrew Heinzman. For the Green Interview, I'm Sylvia Donald Cameron. See you next time.